Okay, good morning. So first, again, my apologies. I did not realize the time difference, but I'm glad that I'm here now. So maybe just to introduce myself, I'm the Deputy Mayor for Health and Human Services for the City of New York. My name is LindaGibbs. My portfolio includes all the health and human service agencies, and in that we have things that you'd expect, like the Child Welfare Agency, the Public Assistance Agency, our homeless agency, on the health side, our public health agency, and our public hospital system. And then a little untraditional, I actually have corrections, probation, and juvenile justice as well. So, and part of the reason for putting that in my portfolio is very much to try to bring the services that the people who are, when they're released from jail and prison, bring them closer to those folks so that when they're released, they have a better chance of success when they get out and then don't re-enter the justice system. These are the origins of our social impact bond our first one that we ventured into. I'll give you a little bit more detail on it, but just to let you know sort of how it came out of the discussion. We, at the beginning of Mayor Bloomberg's third term, which was 2.5 years ago, almost 3 years ago now, we had really looked at the work that we had done around poverty and sort of summed up the lessons to ourselves and thought about, where did we want to make a difference where we hadn't made as much progress as we had hoped. And our attention really turned to the adolescents that are engaged in the criminal justice system. And what we know with these young people is that their incarceration rates were very high, arrest and incarceration, education outcomes were poor, health outcomes were poor, and employment outcomes were poor. And what the mayor asked us to do is to put together a very comprehensive approach on young men, Black and Latino men in New York City, and to approach it holistically from a community view. What can we do that we think might make a difference in changing this trajectory? And so we were putting this together, and I'm not entirely sure what the composition in the audience is, but if it's a mix of government and nonprofit organizations, we had everybody around the table. It's one of these, big projects. Let's get everybody together. And what we devised was a really ambitious agenda. And about halfway through the conversation, we were also simultaneously going through a budget process, which, like most jurisdictions, were cutting programs, cutting services, trying to find savings in our agencies. And the folks at the table said, how do you expect us to be able to really come up with these creative, great new ideas that involve spending dollars, when on the other hand, we're having to really keep within very tight budget constraints. And so I was like, rally on, we can do this, we'll come up with the great ideas, don't give up faith. And about that time, we got information from the social finance folks in the UK on their social impact bond that they had initiated there. And it just struck me as a perfect antidote to the sort of the mind block that was developing around the fact that folks really weren't willing to think as creatively because they knew that there were no resources available. And so we started digging into, how does it work? What are the logistics? What's the work process? And can we make this happen for the city? So the biggest thing that I think was our first hurdle was to go through the 50 or so different initiatives that we have and identify which ones were candidates. Because not every social spending program is going to be appropriate for a social impact bond, because there are great things that you want to be doing, but they don't save money, they actually cost money. And so in that case, it's really not appropriate. Then there are some things, like in our Young Men's Initiative, where the initiative didn't cost anything. It was a change in policy, like ban the box, delaying the interviewing of candidates around their criminal records until they pass sort of the first screening of, hey, this guy looks okay, looks like he might be a promising candidate. Don't make them disclose his criminal background until a later stage of the interviewing process. And so things like that, those are practice changes, didn't cost money. And so about 4 or 5 initiatives fell into the category of those that we believed were good, strong programs to run, more preventive in nature, and by virtue of having the program successful, we'd see big institutional costs on the back end. And it really gets to this issue for government agencies that you have, and also for nonprofits. You've got a lot of spending, but it is totally tied up in those institutional systems. And until you change the outcomes, you can't stop providing the shelter bed or providing the juvenile justice residential placement. You know, you've got to keep doing that. So there's the money's all tied up in those services. And what this does is actually provide an infusion to get that upfront dollar. And so it was, we've done about 4 or 5 different things. Most of them, for us, were more in the justice area. And part of the reason that that was true was that the justice area, housing juvenile offenders, adult offenders, is heavily a city cost. Many of our other social service programs are shared funding, where the city enters into contracts for the services, but the reimbursement comes in part from the state and from the federal government. And so if we did a social impact bond in those areas, the only dollars we could capture were the city savings. And until we can come up with structures where we can actually capture the state and the federal savings, we're really limited to those where there's heavy, disproportionately large city dollars in the initiatives, and that's the case in the justice arena. So the one that we wound up with is, I'm going to do a touch base. Would it be good now if I go into a little bit more detail on the particular initiative that we are doing?
I think so. I think people want to know.
You're on mute.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, I think people want to know a little bit more about how this all actually works in practice, and I don't know. I mean, certainly the documents you sent will be hugely helpful even to refer back to later. So I would say yes. And we don't have a long time. We have only 15 minutes, but I think we'd like to at least hear the details and then ask questions.
Okay, so I'll take it about 5 minutes to describe our initiative, and then we can just open it up for questions. Is that good? Okay. So, and I'm joined by an urban fellow in our office, Allison, who's helped out with putting the materials together. Okay, so our initiative, first let me just describe the program. In New York State, if individuals, young men who are 16, 17, and 18-year-old who commit criminal offenses are actually adjudicated in the adult justice system. They are not in our juvenile justice system. So they are adolescents who are in the adult justice system, but they are housed separately in our Department of Corrections. So their population is not intermingled with those who are over 18. At a point in time, we have about 900 of these young people on Rikers, which is the largest jail facility in New York City. The intervention that we're introducing is a form of cognitive behavioral therapy. We've named it, for our purposes, ABLE, which I can't remember what exactly that stands for. Adolescent Behavioral Learning Experience. Look at that, I did it. And what this is an intervention. The reason that we chose the particular intervention that we did is that it's an open structure, meaning that young people can take a series of 10 episodes of training while you're in incarceration, and then 2 follow-up in the community. But the group is porous, so you can come in and out. And given that lengths of stay on Rikers are very short, we wouldn't be sort of diminishing the impact by having a cohort that starts on day 1 and finishes on day 90. Instead, the group, an individual moves on their own track through the intervention, and people can come and go. And if you leave Rikers at round, at class 6, at level 6, you pick up at level 7 in the community. So it was able to, given the fluidity of the population, it was very important to have one that really, an intervention that accommodated that reality. The basic premise is to help young people take better stock of their actions and the impact that it has on their friends, on their family, on their girlfriends, on their children, and really to think through the consequences. And so it's very much imbuing young people with a surroundings and a set of curriculum and guidance that is assisting them to breathe, stop, think, and behave more responsibly by thinking through the consequences of their act. It's also kind of like the antidote to the adolescent brain. And so the way that the structure is being set up is that we are doing this through our Department of Education school on Rikers. So we have a school that is set up to teach these young people while they're spending time on Rikers. And the teachers are working with two nonprofit organizations that we brought onto the island to work with the corrections officers and the Department of Education staff. The way that savings happen is that studies for interventions like this have shown that there is a reduction of anywhere from 20 to 30% in the reincarceration. So not just rearrest, but reincarceration of individuals who have received the full dose of training. And the way that it works within a corrections facility is that each bed has a different value depending on how many beds you actually reduce. And so and now Kristen Meister is joining us, who is my chief of staff, and who's been the project director on this initiative. In order to get savings from this program, we have to reduce the number of re-entrants into Rikers in this population sufficient to close a 100-bed housing facility. And so there's very minor incremental savings up to the point that we hit that economy of scale enough to close the entire housing unit. And then there's major savings if you're actually able to close an entire jail. But that's not going to happen in our case because we only have one jail facility that houses the adolescents. Our break-even point in looking at the numbers show us that we will break even at about 10% reduction in reincarceration. And the funders that have brought the money to the table are they'll get a return on their investment at that 10% of the money that they put in. If it goes over 10%, they'll start to earn interest income on it up until a 20% reduction in recidivism when they'll earn about 6% a year of a return, and it maxes out at that point. So if we see 30–40% reductions in reincarceration, there'll be no further savings to the investors beyond that initial, what they earn up to that 20%. The investor is Goldman Sachs, and they've done this through their Community Reinvestment Act obligations that are part of the U.S. financial industries. So the law passed 30 or 40 years ago in response to the bank's redlining in very poor neighborhoods where they were not offering loans in those areas. Part of the national response to that was to put obligations on our banks that they make investments in community activities. And so this qualifies as a Community Reinvestment Act obligation. And so from the perspective of a private financial institution's interest, while this is a very high-risk loan, and it's not a loan at all, it's really more like risk venture capital, it qualified under the Community Reinvestment Act financing. And then in our case, the way that we put this first deal together was to use funding that was available to us from Bloomberg Philanthropies, who has invested $30 million together with the Open Society Foundation, has invested another $30 million in the broad Young Men's Initiative undertaking. Bloomberg Philanthropies took a portion of their investment and created a guarantee fund for the Goldman investment. The guarantee fund is up to $7.2 million against the $9.6 million Goldman investment. And so if the thing totally tanks and we get only 7% reduction in reincarceration, or if we get no reduction in reincarceration, Goldman will be able to draw against the entire guarantee fund. They can take the entire 7.2, and they'll be out 2.4 million. If we're successful and the reinvestment and there's a 20% reduction, Goldman will earn 2.1. on top of their original investment for a total return of 11.7 million. And so the structure, we got our budget folks to agree that this was a contract that they were willing to enter into. No risk, it's interesting because given that there was no risk to them whatsoever, and it was only benefit, but still it was very hard to get the budget folks comfortable with this concept, very new, very novel, very different from anything that they were accustomed to. And we got an agency that our department, where actually this idea originated from as a program initiative, comfortable with taking the risk around if in fact the money will come from their budget if the intervention is successful. And we identified our partners, the MDRC, and who then identified 2 nonprofits to do the work. And then the last note, and then we'll take your questions, and we'll all take your questions, is that there's an independent evaluator that we've engaged, Vera Institute, which is an internationally known organization, research institute in social justice and criminal justice in particular, is bringing an independent outside evaluation in order to call whether or not things have crossed the goal line or not. And so we have all those partners in place, and the program began in September, and the evaluation period starts in January, and we've got our fingers crossed. And so maybe this is the time to open it up to your questions.